joining us for this Signatory forum where we're going to be talking about how to engage socioeconomically diverse candidates. So in terms of this topic and socioeconomic diversity, Tech Talent Charter has been really pushing our 800 signatories to try and do more around social mobility. And what we found last year is that only 35% of the companies in our signatory base were actually measuring socioeconomic diversity, and that is by far the lowest level of focus that signatories are putting on any area of diversity and inclusion. So every single other lens of diversity was being measured and focused on by at least half of companies, and socioeconomic diversity was one that was just really lagging behind. So over the past year, we've been trying really hard to surface resources and find individuals and companies that are doing interesting things in this area to try and present a bit of a pathway forward for companies that might want to engage more with this area of diversity and inclusion. What's really interesting about this area of diversity in tech is that when you think about socioeconomic diversity, so essentially wealth and whether someone is from a poor background, a rich background, what does that look like? What's been their access to opportunity? We often think of professions in finance or law, and there is a much stronger trend of practice around socioeconomic diversity in those areas. But what we don't often think about is the tech industry. And the tech industry actually has a similar socioeconomic makeup to professions like journalism. And that's not something that necessarily seems intuitive or apparent when you think about this trait. So in light of that, we have got the fantastic Daniel Ball here, who is the founder and CEO of the Ladder Group. And they have a really interesting specialism around this area of diversity and inclusion. So Dan, I would love you to please introduce yourself and the many organisations as part of the Ladder Group.
Thanks. Great to be here. Yeah, so my name's Dan. I'm not sure I'd be quite as a very flattering kind of introduction from you, but yeah, I'm the founder, as you mentioned, and CEO of the Ladder Group. I founded the organisations nearly 3 years ago now, at the start of 2021. I'm from London. I didn't go to university myself, funnily enough. I started a job when I was 18, worked there for 6 years, left during the first COVID lockdown, and then launched my organisations, nearly 3 years ago now. The Ladder Group's a group of 2 companies and 1 charity, so 3 kind of operating entities, all focused on a mission that's around like access to for those from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds. So our mission statement is to create incredible careers for everyone. Within the group, we have the Early Careers Company, an emerging talent specialist providing sort of strategic consulting around emerging talent and talent acquisition. We have Ladder Consulting, a people and inclusion consultancy with a strong focus on social mobility. And finally, we have the Early Careers Foundation, which is our fully funded in-house social mobility charity. So it's an essential part of our group, but it is its own kind of legally registered charitable entity. And it's a national charity providing support to those from low-income backgrounds to help them kind of build the tools and the knowledge and the exposure, capabilities, and eventually get the financial support they need to access fulfilling careers in the commercial world.
That's fantastic. Thank you. That's great. And I'm going to dig in a little bit more around, you've obviously outlined a lot of different services that are hopefully going to be solutions to this problem around socioeconomic diversity and social mobility. But I'd love to kind of ask you, from your point of view, having set up all these companies, what was the problem?
It's quite a complex and multifaceted one that almost like presents as something relatively simple. I mean, the fundamental problem is that those from lower income backgrounds in the UK and basically most of the world have fewer opportunities and less access compared to those from higher income backgrounds. And it's interesting actually preparing a little bit for this conversation. It's when you really drill down into the different kind of stages in an individual's life that determine their kind of long-term chances and long-term possibilities, you realize that this division starts early, and the almost like the chasm or like the difference between the opportunities and access that people from different socioeconomic or, as you say, wealth backgrounds have means that kind of at every stage of a young person's life, the low-income group becomes further and further underrepresented. So you've got divisions really early on. I mean, some of them specifically apply to tech. So people from low socioeconomic backgrounds are less likely to take IT at GCSE, for example. But basically, the problem starts with obviously education. I mean, it can start very even earlier on with things like nutrition, like access to language growing up as a young child. But in very simple terms, people growing up from lower income backgrounds on average, so this is sort of statistically rather than looking individually, come out with typically fewer and lower level qualifications, which means that the eventual talent pool that we're looking at, there's also issues, of course, around aspiration, confidence, capabilities, communication skills, and so on. But before we even get on to things like looking at accent bias, and so on, people from low-income backgrounds tend to be, at any given age, less qualified than those from higher-income backgrounds because of the opportunities they've had access to.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I guess for the signatories of the Tech Talent Charter, a lot of them are focusing on this from the point of view of like talent. So you obviously deal with a lot of clients who are enlisting your help to try and work on this problem. What's the business side of this problem then? So when those people who have had less access to education, to certain types of nurturing or input throughout their life that would help them get closer to potentially being in that tech talent pool, I mean, how does that then translate into something that a business would end up caring about?
I mean, the first ones are kind of, the first answer, that's really simple, right? A lot of organizations are struggling to hire the quality and volume of people they need. There's a massively squeezed and tight labor market. And on the other side of that, we have an enormous group of highly capable and people with an enormous amount of potential who are under or unrepresented in the talent pools from which these organizations are, in inverted commas, fishing. I mean, the basis of it is that talent is spread evenly across socioeconomic groups and lots of other different diversity metrics. Talent is spread evenly and opportunity and access is not. So, the simplest problem is that by including those from lower income backgrounds and adjusting, and this obviously, I'm sure we'll get onto this a little bit later on in this conversation, but by adjusting the way in which you attract, engage, train, support, assess, and so on, you widen your talent pools is the first thing, right? Like, it means that there are a greater number of individuals to hire from. And I'm sure we'll come on to things, talk about like the differences in and the kind of the impact this has on the organization by diversifying in this way. But the first thing is that companies are struggling to hire and these people are struggling to find great work. It seems like a pretty obvious match.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess why is it that you think businesses aren't engaging on the issue of socioeconomic diversity and social mobility as much as they would with other areas of diversity and inclusion? And I refer back, I guess, to things like earlier on when I was saying that this is only being looked at by 35% of companies, but we all know that every tech company will be aware there's a women in tech problem, for example. So given that this talent is spread evenly across our entire population, why do you think it's not caught on as quickly as other areas?
So I suppose a couple of answers there. The first one, I'm trying to be very sort of candid and open and not get lost in the kind of the ethical side of it and think more from the commercial side as well. The first thing is that talent doesn't equal skills. A lot of organizations, especially in the technology sides of tech businesses, are looking for a particular set of skills, which, while the talent gives an individual the ability to develop that skill or a capability, let's say, they don't have it just by virtue of being talented. So you could get a young person who's not had a huge amount of opportunity, who's incredibly numerically capable. That doesn't mean they're a software engineer, although it does likely give them it's not a great example, but it could give them the capability to become a software engineer. So I suppose that's the first thing. Like, organizations are perhaps at times not investing enough in models that we use, for example, like hire, then train, then start, for example, hire to train type approaches. The second is organizations not having like robust enough internal L&D infrastructure, meaning they have to they're hiring people who can immediately come in and do the job rather than investing in talent who they'll have to kind of upskill and train in order to be able to be effective. I think the other answer you mentioned, kind of women in tech, like, its visibility is a factor, right? And it's a really counterintuitive one because, I mean, gender is a little bit of a separate issue, of course, because in every cultural, ethnic or socioeconomic group, you basically have 50% males, 50% females. But with basically all other diversity metrics, or most other diversity metrics, particularly kind of when you're looking at like culture, ethnicity, and religion, there's a strong intersection between socioeconomic background or social mobility and those those like characteristics. So I think the first reason it's often overlooked is because companies are focusing on things that are more visible. It's more obvious, right, when you have a gender diversity in a workforce, or ethnic diversity in a workforce. It's literally, you can see it on LinkedIn. It's also, these things were conversations and really important topics a little earlier. Social mobility's kind of been a little like late to the party, so to speak, when it comes to these things. So I think that's, for me, probably the biggest single factor, I think, is the lack of visibility of socioeconomic background. Like, from a purely logistical perspective, you have to ask. I mean, by rights, you should also ask when it comes to gender, culture, religion, ethnicity, and so on, but like, you don't know, right? Like, you can have two people, you have someone who looks exactly the same as me, who may have grown up on free school meals and in a really challenging, challenging kind of economic circumstances, whereas, I grew up in a middle-class home in North London, and you couldn't tell that without asking us.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point about the asking, because when we look at what companies are asking, by and large, their processes and policies are driven by the Equality Act and by what's a protected characteristic in the Equality Act. And socioeconomic background is not one of those things. So when we're trying to encourage companies to consider inclusion in the broader sense, it's about getting away from just like following the letter of the law and actually engaging with like, what is the spirit of what we're trying to achieve here, and actually just taking a bit of ownership of that. So it's actually great to hear that it's something that is gaining prominence. It's something that we've seen in the last year. I think the interest that we've had in resources around social mobility, we've seen a threefold increase in engagement on those in the last year, and I really hope that's a good sign of the direction of travel that businesses are taking when it comes to looking at this. So let's get into the meat of everything that I know that your companies do, Dan. Let's talk about what businesses can do then to start engaging and improving that engagement with people from different socioeconomic backgrounds in their talent pipeline. Like, where do you start?
That's quite a big question. I mean, honestly, it depends on the organization itself, right? There are as in, it depends on the size, the scale, the focus. It also depends on the growth plans in terms of like which functions you're hiring into and growing. It also, and this is where, I don't know if this is a helpful comment, it depends what the problem is. Like, is your issue hiring? Is it retention? Is it promotion? We work with lots of organizations that go at the junior level. We're fantastic from a socioeconomic diversity perspective. We track and measure that data, but none of that socioeconomic diversity, none of those individuals from lower income backgrounds progress through to the upper levels of the company. So the first thing to do is like understand what the issue is for a given organization, and then obviously focus on addressing that. I think, I'm not sure if that's a helpful answer. It's not an answer. It's kind of it's almost a deflection. I think it's important to also understand the wider context. One of the pieces of work that is kind of delivered almost the intersection between our social mobility charity and people strategy business is something called social mobility workshops. This isn't a shameless plug, but it was a direct response to client demand. Like, it was like, this isn't even a conversation here. Like, we don't know where to start. And so it's a service we deliver where members of our people consulting team and members of our charities workforce will go in and run, interactive learning sessions and so on about social mobility in society, business, and the issues surrounding it. So I think the first thing is to start the conversation. The second thing, and this is maybe a little bit of a controversial opinion, I think a lot of companies get caught up in, and I imagine this happens more in tech, given the kind of almost like very like numerate nature of these businesses, is that I think people can get a little bit lost in like, well, we don't have the data, so why are we talking about it? Whereas like understanding why something exists, or understanding where something is now, not understanding, where you are now, doesn't preclude you actually from becoming a more socially inclusive company. Right, you without knowing your socioeconomic diversity, you can still take steps to become more socially inclusive. And there are some, some of the product that we deliver for organizations, social mobility reviews, which is help them understand where they are now, what's good, what's not, and how to improve. And in a lot of cases, you don't actually need to know where you are now to identify how you can get better, because there is a lot of really quality literature and research and best practice out there. So, I mean, I would have thought, if this is kind of a quick 101 on where to start, I mean, the first thing you'd look at is who you're hiring and why. You know, we find one very common outcome of those social mobility reviews, and something we do with a lot of businesses we work with across the group, is helping organizations to understand what the innate characteristics and behaviors that predict success in their organization are. You know, there's always an overlap, but there's also always a difference between the kind of characteristics, capabilities, and behaviors an organization should be hiring for and those that they are hiring for. Typically, there are things in the attraction, engagement, campus, selection, or assessment process that reduce the level of socioeconomic diversity, making it through the funnel, but actually have no bearing on success. So the first thing to do is answer the question like, well, what does good look like here? Because in most cases, good isn't good. The principal thing that predicts success is not a degree from Oxbridge, and it definitely isn't like 4 A's from a top public school. In a lot of situations, it's something more intrinsic and more innate that exists outside of those quite niche, typically higher income populations. So understanding what predicts success at your organization, and then ensuring that your attraction and engagement strategy is built on that, rather than built on what I think a lot of companies do, which is a shortcut to it. You know, we need intellectually capable, motivated people. Let's go to the top 10 unis in the UK. It's like, while people from those universities are very likely to be both motivated and intelligent, you can have intelligent, motivated people who haven't been there. So focus on drilling down, defining, distilling what good looks like, rather than taking shortcuts to it based on kind of exclusive or exclusionary criteria. That was very wordy. Was that helpful?
Here it's like make sure you're solving the right problem. So ID, what is the problem? Where does it lie? Make sure that you're using like the right predictors of success. Like, have you got that right, or are you using proxies? And the other thing that I think is really important for this topic, potentially more so than anything else, any other areas, I think, is start acting now rather than just like getting caught up in process. Like, oh my God, we don't have data for this, and how do we measure it, and how do we ask people? And you know, that's a whole little storm in itself that can be really hard to wrangle for a lot of organizations. And data absolutely has a place, don't get me wrong, as an organization, Tech Talent Charter, but it's a really heavy emphasis on measurement and data because of the role that we play in the tech ecosystem. But as you say, it's not a formulaic schedule of how you approach things, and data is useful, but it doesn't have to, preclude you from
doesn't tell the forced. And doesn't tell, I mean, that is basically, I should have said that. That was a much more concise, succinct, and focused version of what I was trying to say. So thanks. And for anyone listening, just that's what I meant. Exactly right. I mean, that's the point. I spoke to a company a few months ago who are now doing some really interesting work with around those core characteristics and behavior piece that I just spoke about. And they said, oh, well, how can we start looking at like socioeconomic kind of inclusion or social inclusion where we don't even know who is from a low income category? I was like, well, you can start by not just recruiting from 6 universities. Like, we know that's going to improve it. So you might as well do that while we're looking at these pieces. So exactly right, like start now, do the things that we know make a difference. And frankly, this again might sound like a bit of a plug, but like get experts in who actually understand these issues to go, where are the quick wins? Because you can dramatically improve outcomes often with some relatively sort of low complexity changes that are pretty highly impactful. And then you can focus on the longer term kind of strategy and vision pieces further down the line.
Great. So let's talk about some of those like low-hanging fruit pieces, the things that you can just get stuck into straight away. So you mentioned like broaden your expectations of where you can get great people from. You're not just limiting yourself to like Russell Group unis or whatever kind of approach there. What are some of those other things that if people don't really know that much about social mobility practice, what can and should they be doing?
You can drive a much more inclusive assessment process. I mean, basically it's chronological, right? It's like, first thing is like, what is your value proposition and your go-to-market what's your like go-to-market narrative? How are you representing and explaining yourself? And are you doing that in a sort of socially inclusive way? And I realize inclusive sounds like a bit of a buzzword, but it does make sense. Again, I've worked with loads of organizations in my career where, their hearts are absolutely in the right place. I'm not sure if organizations have hearts. You know what I mean? Their intentions are good, but actually it's when you often see the way these organizations present and communicate who they are and their value proposition, like I look at it, I think like my dad growing up on a council estate in Stoke-on-Trent would have no idea what an institutional investor is, for example, or what like, machine learning driven means. And so being able to almost sort of focus on like an education first value proposition, go-to-market approach, attraction strategy, and almost apply the same logic in your interview process. You know, we have a bit of a mantra here, which is that you have to educate people before you can assess them. So, you know, helping, the next thing you can do once you've kind of created a more socially inclusive attraction strategy, employer brand, and EVP, is you can then look at, like, well, what are you testing for? So first of all, what good looks like and the core characteristics piece I spoke about, but then how are you testing for these things? Are you inadvertently running assessment processes that exclude those from certain kind of minority or underrepresented groups, including socioeconomic, to identify things that don't predict success in your organization? Then you get on to things that are, sorry.
If you don't mind, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt there for a second. What are some of those things that people are using as ineffective proxies, in addition to the university piece?
In an assessment process or in an attraction strategy?
In an assessment process.
So a good example is lots of organizations running purely virtual assessment centers. I mean, this is a very specific example, and it's not to say they're not good, but you know, the ability of a middle-class kid in a 4-bedroom, semi-detached house in, I don't know, Norfolk, West London, their ability to sit in a quiet room, focused. You know, I've been involved in these before. I've been shadowing them. I've run them in the past, and some people have to dial in from coffee shops, from busy houses with poor internet connection. We had one person dialing in from their phone because one of their family members was using like the computer and stuff. People dialing in from libraries and so on. So there are things that automatically create barriers to those from certain income backgrounds. There are a whole host of different examples there. It's also the level of preparation. If you've gone to, I was going to say Eton, Oxford, but that seems deliberately that seems a little bit too far down one angle. But if you've gone to a private school and then after Russell Group University, you'll have had a huge amount more support of how to interview, how to deal with an assessment centre. You might have even done mock ones. Another one is organizations looking for people that have done very relevant internships in specific organizations, or industrial placements, or spring weeks. You know, someone from a private school background versus a low-income background is far more likely to put them forward for a spring week in the first year of university, or an internship going into year 2 to complete at the end of their penultimate year. They're obviously more likely to be at university in the first place. So the more of these restrictions that you add in that might, as you say, be a proxy for the things that predict success but don't predict success in themselves, the more kind of exclusionary your process can be. And I think the point here is not companies just go and hire everyone. The point is to drill down into, like, who should you be hiring, why, and then can we use that to broaden your talent pool? The answer is almost always yes, by the way. My company would be very successful if it wasn't.
I think these examples are really helpful because oftentimes if we work in talent or people management or we're tech hiring managers, it's very easy to get blind to these types of things if that's not your experience. So, I mean, thinking about the experience to the next stage, you've talked a bit about attraction, you've talked a bit about the assessment approach. Let's talk about the hire and the onboarding bit. How do we make sure that that is inclusive? Where are the pitfalls there? What are we coming up against that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, great question, and a really important one that a lot of people are forgetting. Like, someone signing a contract is not the end of the battle. Battle's probably not quite the right word, but you know what I mean. It's not the end of the steps you need to take to create a socially inclusive, working ecosystem or working world. I mean, the first thing is, of course, making sure that the people in your organization, the organization into which they're being onboarded and so on, understand these issues. That's, again, part of the purpose of the social mobility training programs and workshops and so on that we run. Like, do the managers in your organization understand kind of issues around social mobility, socioeconomic diversity, class, blah, blah, blah? Like, are these things understood? Have you trained assessors and managers and so on in accent bias? Are you making, like, reasonable adjustments to understand that someone who gets something a little bit wrong in their first few weeks doesn't approach something exactly the right way because it's their first job and they, no one in their family or personal or extended kind of family circles has got a job in a suit in a building or works in tech or whatever? Are we making, in the same way you would for disability and for other things, are we making reasonable adjustments to allow these people to thrive and succeed? So I think, the biggest one for me there is, and it's the same thing goes for education, by the way. Like, I mean, there's laws and stuff in place, for teachers and in the education world around, like, There's a colleague of mine, Jodie, who you know was actually worked for Teach First for a few years and would know the phrasing much better than I. But effectively, individualization is the responsibility of teachers to make sure they're adapting what they're doing to each individual child. Well, you know, good employers should be doing the same thing. And that's not to say that all behavior and all attitude is acceptable and excusable, because it isn't. But there are a lot of issues that are more likely to crop up, you know, when you've got a socioeconomically diverse population. So, and the first thing is educating leaders and managers in those things.
That's really great. I would love to talk a bit more about like talking about it, because you've mentioned your workshops, and I'm really interested to hear the sort of things that you're covering when you're talking to these companies that you're working with to try and increase the level of empathy, awareness, education around this as a topic. And I'm also really interested to hear, is that the sort of thing that's best placed when someone is newer to an organization? Are people approaching this as a once off, and is that happening at a senior level? Like, where is the education currently happening internally in businesses around socioeconomic diversity, and where should it be happening?
Cool. It's a nice simple question there. So we do it in two ways, and it's not so it's perfect, but it's working and it's great and it's impactful. So one is workshops. It typically applies to slightly smaller organizations where you've got 70 people. We can run a half day or a day's workshop. There's like kind of a menu of like learning talks and then like interactive sessions. And they can cover different topics depending on what our client or customer wants. Typically, they'll cover things like social mobility in the DEI landscape, the linguistics of social mobility, or sociolinguistics of DEI and class, and so on. So equipping people with the right language, the right kind of understanding. Also looking at context, like why is getting people on board and excited. Social mobility in the workplace. Why is socioeconomic diversity good for organizations? Why is it good for the economy of the UK? And why is it important all over the Western world? So it depends on kind of where the conversation is. Like there is one talk, which is what is social mobility? And you'd be amazed how many people are keen for that to be included because they're so early on in that journey. For larger organizations, we would typically look at like, well, to whom are socioeconomically diverse individuals joining the company kind of mostly exposed to or supported by? So one thing I didn't mention in answer to the previous question is there are other things you can do early on. So again, obviously more things that we do. You can see it all coming together, right? Everything we do, all the different services are designed to create more socially inclusive organizations and more socioeconomically diverse workforces. Another one is looking at what's your program architecture, what's the infrastructure, what support mechanisms do you have in place? Do you have a mentoring program? A really common follow-on from a social mobility review is build an internal mentoring program. Because then this is another thing worth bearing in mind. Social mobility's got worse in the UK. You know, I think we were fourth or fifth in the sort of developed Western world for social mobility back in 2007, 8, 9, 10, and we are now second worst after the USA. So social mobility it's the reason Sir Peter Lampole, I met a few weeks ago, it's the reason he set up the Sutton Trust, was because he basically thought someone from my background now isn't able to make the amount of money I've made in Britain today. So he set out to change it. So as a result, there are mostly people from low-income backgrounds in the senior levels of a lot of companies. You might not know it, but a lot of them are there. You know, like in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of people in poverty in the UK. There are a lot of people from lower income backgrounds, and many of those have risen up and succeeded in the working world. So when the conversation gets started, we've seen it time and time again, people putting their kind of hat in the ring and saying, I'd love to be a mentor to someone coming in on our early careers program. I actually grew up in a single parent family in Middlesbrough. You know, I had elocution lessons, so you wouldn't know, but that's actually my story. So things like mentoring programs can help. Sorry, remind me what your second question was. I've gone back to your first one.
No, it's really interesting because I was asking about like what should we be doing in terms of talking about this? So talking about social mobility in companies and what does that look like and where should it be? And I'm hearing that obviously that's really context dependent, and that's really important because we sometimes hear from SMEs, oh, this is just too complex for me, can't handle it.
Too much for us.
Yeah, too much for us. So I think that's interesting, but also the angle that you were talking about there around language and how do we talk about this, that's also something that has come up a lot. I know you've mentioned kind of class and accent a little bit here, and these are things that I think we here at Tech Talent Charter make people a little bit nervous of how do we talk about this and start having these conversations so that we can run a mentor program.
That's exactly right, and you're spot on. Like, what is that? What are these different things? What do they mean? How should we talk about them? I think it is enormously important. I mean, you'll notice you haven't heard me and won't hear me say like disadvantaged. Right? Like, no one wants to be disadvantaged. I don't want to have someone brilliant in my company who thinks they're at an inherent disadvantage. A lot of people from lower income backgrounds may not feel disadvantaged in the slightest. They may feel massively empowered by the challenges they've had to face and the hurdles they've had to jump over to get to where they are. So you're right, using the right language is enormously important. The more immediately impactful work we do, and we recommend a lot, I personally think all companies should do it, but we deliver for many of our clients, is around like social mobility training. So where you're a small company and you can get everyone in a room or whatever, we can run workshops, or everyone in a function or a team. We can run these kind of like more interactive workshops. But for larger organizations who go, great, we are launching an apprenticeship, and I'll come back to that, but again, probably 30% of the work the group does is building organizations' apprenticeships such that we're able to bring in people younger from a naturally more diverse talent pool. We go, great, okay, we're bringing in all these apprentices. Well, now actually we need to equip our managers and leaders to deal with it. And so we build often bespoke, but, you know, formulaic in some ways, kind of multi-part, multi-week or month social mobility training programs for leaders and for managers. And there are so many simple things, like if you've got a start class in July and it's apprentices and we know we're looking for socioeconomic diversity, don't start by asking like, oh, where did you go skiing this year? Like, you'd be amazed. I notice it even in my company, a company with like a deep knowledge and awareness of this, with literally a bank of desks made up of a social mobility charity. I still walk in and hear like, I prefer Val d'Isere to teen. Well, it's not particularly inclusive, is it? You know, so yeah, it happens everywhere, and there's a lot. Once people understand the issue, care about it, and are equipped with the tools to combat it, they can succeed.
I mean, when you draw parallels like that, it's just so obvious, isn't it? When you highlight things like that, that it has to pervade everything that we're doing in terms of how we communicate. And you mentioned,
yes, don't not talk about it. It's fine to mention your skiing holiday. If you just come back from Val d'Isere, what you don't want to do is come back in and be like, oh no, we've got a socioeconomically diverse person over there, better not mention skiing. That's not the point. It's about the way in which it's delivered and the way discussions are held and the way the company culture develops to include them. Anyway, sorry.
No, it's great. I can hear your passion coming through, which is awesome, because we need a little bit of this in social mobility work, really, I think. So you mentioned managers a fair few times here, and I just want to ask, I know that you've said that you've had really good responses from managers at clients that you've worked for who have gone, oh yeah, you know, I relate to that background, great, let's do this mentoring program, or, you know, who have just responded well to this. But did you come up against that kind of opposite kind of reaction? I'm sure it's never overt in how it's presented, but you know, there are probably people who still do think that the things that they see on a CV or in conversation with people that are actually just markers of, you know, economic and socioeconomic privilege, like that they think that they're valid. They think that they're right and they're fine, and that having a certain type of accent does make you more professional. You know, do you come up against those kinds of attitudes that are still quite negative?
To be honest with you, not that much. Like, and I'm pleased to say that certainly wasn't the case in my career 7 or 8 years ago. It was like, you know, they're not polished, need to be more polished, you know, that type of stuff we used to hear. But no, I think honestly, no, not so much, honestly. For the most part now, with social mobility, or individuals from low-income backgrounds succeeding in the workplace, it's like, crap, I have no idea how to go about fixing this issue in my company. I know I want to, I know it matters. I think you've got to be pretty stupid, basically, to believe that someone is more or less capable because of the way their voice sounds. My mum has a very posh accent. My dad has a very thick accent from Stoke-on-Trent. They're both very similarly capable, albeit capable in different areas. Like, I don't think there are that many people. There might be a lot of unconscious bias. There's certainly that. You know, I think, no, I don't think there's a huge amount of that, frankly. I think most people understand there's an issue here. A lot of people we speak to really understand the intersectionality between this and other key diversity metrics. But yeah, I think people have progressed mostly beyond that now. It doesn't apply to things like the proxies we spoke about. There are a lot of people out there who think having gone to a top university means you're smarter than someone who hasn't, which like purely on average, isn't statistically incorrect, right? The proportion of people in the top decile for intellect at Cambridge will be higher than the general population, but there'll be people in the general population who are immensely capable and the people with Cambridge who aren't. So it's all about identifying, as we said before, those predictors of success, building that into your recruitment process. And, you know, within one intake group of really capable, socioeconomically diverse individuals, any of those doubters will have their minds changed by these brilliant, hardworking young people from less privileged backgrounds than them.
That's really, really good to hear. Like, and obviously there's a degree to which that's self-selecting, because the people that are working with the ladder group are obviously going to be people who buy into this and know that it's a good thing to do, which is great. But I also loved you flagging some of the language that you've come across previously, because that's a really good flag for us to look out for. Like, if we're hearing people talk about this person needs to be more polished, that's a really good thing to go, oh well,
yeah,
okay,
polish mostly means posh, basically.
Yeah. That's super interesting for just like flagging, I think. And what you were saying about bias with accent as well, it's a really interesting one. So there's a great report out by Accent Bias in Britain, and they highlight, you know, what is the prestige hierarchy when it comes to different accents, and how do they translate, and what does that look like? And, you know, accent does still play a part in unconscious bias, as you rightly say, but it's really easy to overcome. So they've done some really great randomized controlled field trials of this, and shown that if you simply flag to someone this person has an accent, or make them aware that there is an accent that might be at play in terms of influencing their decisions, accent bias immediately loses its potency. Similarly, if folks are front-loading conversations with data and with evidence, that also completely offsets any unconscious bias around accent. So these are just a few tidbits from these various reports that are available, but there is some really interesting stuff out there if you want to dig into accent bias in a bit more detail. So we've talked a little about language. We've talked a little about the types of things that people are using as potential markers of the wrong proxies, really, here. I would love to ask you, just because we're coming up to time now, in terms of socioeconomic background and this being part of general practice in the workplace, where do you see this going, given that this is everything that your businesses do day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I got this bit wrong. Wouldn't bode well for us, would it? I don't think it's very long at all until it is a protected characteristic. First of all, I can see a situation. I've had a lot of conversations with people involved in this process that we are progressing towards a situation where it's included in the list, in the characteristics list, in the Equalities Act. So I think people are going to have to start reporting it. People are going to have to start looking at it, start tracking it. It's going to start becoming more and more like prevalent and then legally required. Again, I don't think we're many years away at all from companies having to publish like a class pay gap. So it's part of the reasons, like, get ahead of the curve. Like, we already know it's the right, there's so much evidence to show that it's the right, like, move commercially, especially in a tight talent market where you can't hire enough people in tech businesses anyway. So it's something that makes sense commercially. It's quite obviously the right thing to do, and soon it's going to be legally required. Just like start now. So that's kind of the direction I think it's headed. I think it's an issue, and I don't know if this is an overly optimistic sort of glass half full way of looking at it, but there's a level of like self-perpetuation in this. Once you start to tackle it, and Charlotte, I feel like I'm hosting myself here. Sorry, tell me, Charlotte, if I shouldn't, Lexi. But I saw Charlotte's question on the chat on Zoom. And Charlotte, to your point about there's lots of conversations going on around social mobility in early careers, but how do we increase the levels at the kind of mid to senior, increase representation at the mid to senior level? I think to that point, unlike some other areas where some of the other kind of characteristics, ethnicity, religion, and so on, it's less easy to hire in. Like, if you're hiring someone who is in the mid to senior level of another tech company into your tech company, they're already socially mobile. That's already happened. You're not doing social mobility. You're just moving someone who is a product of social mobility. I mean, it's the same agenda, right? You know, I spoke to a CTO a few months ago. I remember saying, we're really passionate about women in tech, so just hired 20 experienced developers. And I was like, great, but you aren't just moving them from one company to another. Like, you're not actually bringing women into the work, into that world or that function. So I think also, Charlotte, a lot of companies would be surprised to hear, especially larger organizations, how many socially mobile individuals there are in their senior levels. And that's about having a really sensitive, intelligent, anonymized and external survey kind of data, not survey, but survey data collection, experience, focus group, EDP style exercise going on. So yeah, I see this becoming a more and more prevalent issue. I think more and more companies are cottoning onto the intersectionality. They're focusing on, and we see, I still speak to companies now, I go, social mobility we're not looking at, we're only focused on minority ethnic representation at this stage. It's like, but the two are so intertwined. If you have a more socioeconomically diverse workforce, because people from minority ethnic backgrounds are overrepresented in the low income category, as with religious minorities and others, if you have a more socioeconomically diverse workforce, there will likely be increased minority ethnic representation as well, almost certainly at the right scale. So I think more and more companies are cottoning onto the fact these are not standalone characteristics, they're strongly kind of intersectional. And I hope it remains a hot topic. It's something that it's something that is enormously important for the success of our country, our economy, our people. It's, the government's got this enormous leveling up strategy. Well, this is the way. The foundation, my charity's tagline is a great first job changes everything. It will have a revolutionary impact, I think, on society if companies can begin to get this stuff right.
That is such an amazing gauntlet to throw down for the end of our session here. So much for coming to join us for this session today. Really fantastic to hear about what the Ladder Group is doing and about your thoughts on this topic. And we'll make sure that we share this across the Tech Talent Charter's open playbook, which is freely accessible for everyone who wants to hear more about your work. Thank you.
Sounds great. My pleasure. And as you can probably tell, it's an area I'm really passionate about. So if anyone wants to chat more over a glass of wine or a coffee or Zoom or whatever, they know where I am.
Fantastic. And we'll make sure that we add links in the notes on the video as well, so you can find them below.
Sounds good.
Thank you.